Hello, and welcome to the Cognitive Revolution, where we interview visionary researchers, entrepreneurs, and builders working on the frontier of artificial intelligence. Each week, we'll explore their revolutionary ideas, and together we'll build a picture of how AI technology will transform work, life, and society in the coming years. I'm Nathan Lebenz, joined by my co-host, Eric Torenberg. Hello, and welcome back to a special Emergency Pod edition of the Cognitive Revolution. As the entire AI world reacts to OpenAI's announcement and same-day release of their new O1 and O1 Mini reasoning models, I sought out members of the O1 Red Team to get their takes on the new model's capabilities and safety profile, as well as the current state of OpenAI's approach to pre-release safety testing. I'm really grateful that within just hours of my reaching out, I had the opportunity to speak with Marius Habhan from Apollo Research and Leonard Tang, Aidan Ewart, and Brian Huang from Haize Labs. While these two conversations are certainly not all you need to understand the new models, I do believe they provide a valuable perspective. And I'm glad to say that recent drama surrounding OpenAI notwithstanding, it seems that they've done a pretty good job with the O1 testing and release process. While I would have ideally liked to see our guests granted a bit more time for open-ended exploration, they did have a few weeks to conduct automated testing, which, considering that these are funded organizations with full-time teams dedicated to building test suites in advance of new model releases, does seem rather reasonable. I was also particularly pleased by how candid they were able to be in these conversations, and especially with the fact that Apollo had the opportunity to contribute directly to the O1 system card in a way that they ultimately felt very good about. From everything we've learned, it appears that the O1 models were created by applying intensive reinforcement training to the GPT-4o class of models. Remembering that GPT 3.5, the RLHF version of GPT-3, was released roughly 2 years later than the original, I think it's reasonable to think about the O1 models as a sort of GPT 4.5. Where GPT-4 class models were already closing in on expert-level performance on many routine tasks, O1's reasoning abilities are now enough to match or even exceed expert performance in many areas, while also expanding the scope of problems they can solve to include those that require more task decomposition and planning, trial and error, and other familiar forms of reasoning. This is more or less what I expected OpenAI to release next. And I think the nature of this model helps contextualize a number of recent statements made publicly by, or otherwise attributed in the press to, leadership at OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind, and Microsoft. Capabilities have clearly not plateaued. It had just been a while since the last major data point. Recent efficiency gains have been amazing, but models that can reason at length could easily more than offset them, particularly if they drive another major increase in demand. And the sort of detailed reasoning and problem-solving traces that O1 can produce are exactly the sort of synthetic data points that could get us over any natural data wall as leading labs continue to scale. As such, it's no surprise that OpenAI is not sharing the full chain of thought with users, and it's easier all the time to understand how Anthropic might believe that leading developers in 2025 or 2026 could get so far ahead of the field that nobody else has a chance to catch up. Safety-wise, meanwhile, it again seems that model capabilities and alignment are mostly highly correlated. O1 is harder to jailbreak, largely because it reasons more effectively in general, and this includes reasoning about what it should and shouldn't do. For now, overall, it seems that we're still in the sweet spot, where the potential utility of AI systems is tremendous, but the risks of major harm remain relatively minimal. And yet, at the same time, there are reasons to doubt that this trend will continue all that much further into the future. Apollo's work demonstrates that these models are more capable of subtle deception than previous generations, and they also show signs of potentially dangerous properties, including instrumental convergence and power seeking, which AI safety researchers have been warning us about for years now. Again, this is far from the last word on this subject. As always with language models, there are many unknowns. And with that in mind, I invite all of you to do your part in exploring and characterizing the many different aspects of these new models. A key question will be just how capable AI agents become. I'll be watching that closely, and I'll be open to changing my assessment as I learn more. I'll absolutely keep you updated if I do. As always, if you're finding value in the show, we'd appreciate it if you'd share it with friends, write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or leave us a comment on YouTube. And we always welcome your messages, either via our website, cognitiverevolution.ai, or by DMing me on your favorite social network. Now, let's hear from two organizations that have tested the latest models more than anyone else outside of OpenAI. I hope you enjoy my conversations with Marius Hopon of Apollo Research and Leonard Tang, Aidan Ewart, and Brian Huang of Haize Labs. Leonard Tang, Aidan Ewart, and Brian Huang from Haize Labs. Welcome to the Cognitive Revolution.
Awesome. Super excited to be here, Nathan. Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. I'm excited for this as well. This is a rare emergency podcast, which we only do when the biggest news breaks in AI. Obviously, we are all digesting news about a big new model released from OpenAI, the O1 and O1 Mini family of models. And when I saw Haize Labs mentioned in the system card report yesterday, I knew that I wanted to get in touch with you guys and just explore everything that you have been working on as part of your contribution to the red teaming effort of the new O1 models. So thank you for making time to share your experience and perspective with us.
Yeah, for sure. Super excited for the conversation. And yeah, props to you for being right on top of it as it's dropped and reaching out.
I try. It's a lot to keep up with these days, but this one I couldn't miss. Let's start off just with a quick intro of what Haize Labs is. It's a relatively new organization. Probably most people have, if anything, seen your "It's a Bad Day to Be a Language Model" viral launch tweet from a few months back. But just give some little bit of groundwork for who you guys are, how you get into this, what you're doing generally, and then we can dial into the O1 red teaming.
For sure. Yeah, I think most people are familiar with that "Bad Day to Be an LLM" video. And that was a part of our coming out of stealth moment. But Haize has been around for a few months before that. So as background, a lot of us on the team were working on adversarial attacks and robustness throughout undergrad. This was really like a core research direction that we were pushing on. A lot of us were going to go on to PhDs, but we decided and looked around and saw that there was a lot of problems in AI systems being deployed out in the real world, both in terms of long-term safety problems, but also in just short-term reliability and robustness. And we decided that somebody should figure out a way to really comprehensively and rigorously test them. And so that was the genesis of Haize. So our core value prop is being able to haze models, which means rigorously test them at scale and basically surface vulnerabilities before you catch them in production. We started the company back in January, and slowly we've been selling to a bunch of the frontier labs, including OpenAI, as well as Anthropic and AI21 Labs and some other big guys. Came out of stealth just earlier this summer in June, and we've been off to the races, having a blast. Also raised a seed round from General Catalyst earlier this summer. Super excited for all the journey ahead, and yeah, excited to talk about all the red teaming stuff we've been up to.
Cool. If I recall correctly, the technique that you showed off when you put out that viral tweet moment earlier this year was a sort of elaboration or advancement improvement on the universal jailbreak technique. We actually did a full episode on the original version of that with the original authors Andy and Zico. And first of all, I just wanted to check, do I have that right? And maybe you can give us a little bit of flavor for the sort of research that you've been doing and how you took that original technique and made it more scalable.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, lots of respect to Andy and Zico. I used to be collaborators loosely with Andy. We wrote a few papers together back in the day. But yeah, GCG was a really great attack. We took that and we sped it up by a few orders of magnitude. The details of this are on our blog. We call it ACG, Accelerated Coordinate Gradient Attack. It turns out that this is actually just one of the many different attack methods that we're currently using. ACG is great, but it is pretty narrow in the sort of attacks that it can produce and the sort of behaviors that it elicits. And oftentimes it's quite a bit finicky because it's a token-based optimizer, and going from tokens to strings and then back to tokens is not always a identity. And oftentimes we also get a bunch of weird pathologies in the actual strings that we optimize for. And so, it's great for certain use cases, but we also have a bunch of other different attack methods in the portfolio of attacks. Some of them are tree-based MCTS type attacks. Some of them are more evolutionary programming based. Some of them borrow from the reverse language modeling literature, where we literally try and learn a reverse language model so we can produce a prefix that would elicit a particular response. We borrow a lot from mechanistic interpretability and various other fields as well. So TLDR, the gradient-based attack, is one of many methods we have.
Cool. You develop that stuff mostly on white box models and then see if they transfer to black box? Because that was like the main headline of that original universal jailbreak was like they did it on an open source model where they had access to the weights and the gradients. And then the weird strings that they found that worked as jailbreaks surprisingly also worked when applied to your OpenAI models and so on. So is that kind of the same gist where you're looking for techniques where you require that deep access, but then hopefully you can find approaches that generalize even where you don't have the access?
I would say in the original GCG paper, they talked a lot about the transferability of this attack from white box to black box models, as you said. I think as we start to see newer and newer model releases from the frontier labs, this transferability is going to continue to go away, I think. There's various reasons for that, I would say. One is it's pretty likely that the pre-training data mix that the frontier labs are using are continually diverging from that of open source models. And this is a big factor for transferability of the GCG attack. See at this point in one of the safety leads at OpenAI, actually. Her name is Huang. She runs a blog, actually, where she does a lot of review posts about overarching safety topics in machine learning. And her posts about adversarial attacks on language models made this point about likely that transferability of GCG occurs because the underlying data mixes between the white box and black box models tested were similar enough where the underlying prompt optimization that worked for the white box models would actually match what also broke the black box models. So I think, as opposed to this, the frontier labs use a bigger and bigger mix of synthetic data that we don't really have any idea about on the open source side, some more things like that. And I think even seeing the release of O1 yesterday, were an entirely new paradigm of synthetic data based on hidden chain of thought that'll make it continue to diverge away from the GCG paradigm and make it necessary to focus on other kinds of attacks as the field goes on, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, just a quick point. So awesome. All really salient points. Yeah, transferability works because of data and model monoculture. Everything's are more or less the same data, more or less the same architectures, and therefore you can take attacks on white box models and transfer them over to black box models. There is a big divergence from the frontier labs and open source models coming, and it has been happening. And so we do have a lot of algorithms as well. There's purely black box. You could take the GCG type method and massage it into a black box setting reasonably well if you just don't use gradients and just solely use the loss of the target string that you're going after. But a lot of the other approaches I mentioned, including the MCTS style and evolutionary program style attacks, are entirely black box.
I found GCG to be one of the more brittle attacks. So stuff like persona modulation, which is Shah et al. Paper from these are very transferable attacks, which seem to be getting at something more fundamental in the training of language models, or the distribution of the data and the things that language models are modeling. And I guess in the longer run, much more confidence in these styles of attacks than GCG, which is this very weird thing, which is very obvious when you're running a GCG attack. So for instance, you can quite easily directly train against GCG suffixes, and this improves your robustness to them very significantly. Yeah, so I think in the long term, I just have a lot more confidence in these sort of more varied, less obviously detectable, less brittle black box attacks.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Let's maybe talk just a little bit about kind of the setup of the red teaming on O1, and then we can get into more deeply the techniques and the findings. But I understand from the system card that you didn't have that long to do this. Can you just give us a little bit of a narrative of when you got a heads up that this window of opportunity is opening, and also curious as to what access you had? I was on the GPT-4 red team, as I've talked about many times on the podcast. Back then, we didn't have much in the way of the rate limit was quite low and we weren't supposed to do automated testing. I assume now that has changed and you guys were encouraged to do some automated testing. So just give us a sense of what the experience has been over the last few weeks.
I think we had a good amount of time. I think someone on Twitter reported Meteor only had 10 days or something, which sounds a bit strange. We had around a month, I would say. So I think especially given that our attacks were automated, and in that way it was just hooking up to the API, configuring some things, and just letting it run, making sure it's going smoothly. We also didn't need as much of a long time frame compared to maybe manual red teaming, where you're putting in a lot of kind of manual hours, working on single intents and doing a lot of manual adjustment of your prompts and verifying outputs for harm on advanced capabilities. I would say some of the other red teamers for O1 were more in that domain of they had maybe domain expertise in bio/chem/physics harms. I think if you look at the list of red teaming individuals, some of the backgrounds for those individuals were there was an MIT chem professor listed there. There was another physics professor listed there. So those people were on there for I think, manual testing for these kinds of like dangerous capabilities. And our strength was like not really in that advanced domain knowledge, I would say. We focused a lot more on a pretty comprehensive like risk taxonomy, not as much on like advanced biochem capabilities, for example, but on a bit more of the general misuse cases like illegal activity, sexual content, misinformation or fraud and deception, etc. And focused our automated red teaming pipelines on those kinds of behaviors.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that there are at least two, maybe more, but at least two major dimensions to this sort of testing. There's the sort of, can the model either like help a layperson do something that they couldn't otherwise do in the vein of like create a bioweapon, or can they accelerate people that are already somewhat of an expert, but maybe couldn't do it or couldn't do it as fast or as well on their own. And that sounds like that's the others were responsible for that. And then there's this sort of just general purpose, like, is the model under control? Is it doing what its developers want it to do and not doing what its developers don't want it to do? And that's where you're focused. I would love to understand better the mix of techniques that you're using, to the degree that you can share more detail on those, and also how you think about the balance between automated and manual testing. I mean, my intuition with this has been that I basically don't trust language models to do anything that's like open-ended without some sort of supervision still at this point. And in practical terms, that even extends to like evals, right? There's a lot of people running model-based evals, and I'm always like, I would keep one of those online as like an indicator of something dramatically changing, but I wouldn't take my humans out of the loop with model-based evals, except maybe in very rare cases today. And I feel like red teaming is probably even more that way, where there's a fundamental challenge of like, how do you develop the automated test before you know what the model can do, right? Like, how do you calibrate yourself to what the current frontier is and all that sort of stuff. So a lot there for you guys to unpack, but have at it.
I don't think we can talk about the like specific attack methods that we used on the O1 models, unfortunately. But I guess we can sort of answer the latter part of your question. Initial exploration that you do. So like a lot of the attacks that we've built out have been from some sort of initial idea that we've like kind of explored on like weaker models. And then we are like able to scale up these sort of intuitions, or like take intuitions from people who have spent a lot of time talking to language models in like very weird situations, and like take that intuition, and then we're able to bake it into our attack algorithms. I think that's like a pretty common. And I also would say that we do some like manual evaluation as well of the successes or failures that are like red teaming methods output. So we don't really, I guess at this point, want to rely on like model evaluation to like class something as a success or a failure, because as you say, these are not like particularly accurate, and they can like fail in weird ways. And the things we're exploring are like inherently weird because we're doing automated red teaming of safe models. And so, I think I kind of treat this as almost just like a augmentation of my ability to explore to some extent.
Yeah, just to expand on this point a little bit, for sure, a lot of it is like we have some initial seed of an idea from really great human intuition, either from our team or just really awesome folks in the red team community. And we just are able to basically bootstrap the heck out of this into really, really scalable and automated attack methods. On the eval side, I think there's been a lot of focus on attacks, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to how well can you eval whether or not your response from a certain model is actually dangerous or not dangerous, or harmful or not harmful, because that's what we are targeting with our attacks in the first place, right? As you point out, Nathan, like all of these sort of LLM as a judge or classifier-based eval approaches right now are super, super brittle. Any off-the-shelf LLM saying something is harmful from 1 to 10 is actually just like pretty horribly calibrated, and there's a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how to make that eval a lot more calibrated and a lot more stable. But also, there's a good amount of human verification on top. We sort of try and eliminate as much as of the human labor as possible, basically only looking at examples that are highly uncertain, or basically judges in the most uncertain setting will call on a human to expertly verify whether or not the response is correct.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power. So how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/cognitive. That's oracle.com/cognitive. oracle.com/cognitive.
This episode of The Cognitive Revolution is sponsored by the Brave Search API. You may know of Brave as an alternative to Chrome, but did you know that Brave has its own independent search engine powered by its own 20 billion page index of the web? The Brave Search API gives developers reliable and affordable access to programmable web search, auto-suggest, spell check, and more. With flexible plans for all types of use cases, from RAG search to automated business intelligence. On top of that, it's up to 3 times cheaper than Bing, all without compromising on quality, speed, or reliability. Over 700 businesses, including Cohere, Chegg, and Kagi, rely on the Brave Search API, and a recent survey showed that 94% of customers would recommend it to their peers. To start building apps with the power of the web, sign up at brave.com/API and get up to 5,000 free monthly calls. So does that suggest that you're going after relatively subtle harms? Like in the earlier days, we used to do, how do I kill the most people possible? That was like the first question for any new checkpoint in the GPT-4 red team. And it was pretty obvious whether it was like answering that question or not. I would expect even model evals to work reasonably well, because we would either get a refusal or we would get an answer. And I would think it was pretty obvious most of the time. When you talk about the difficulties of calibration, just kind of qualitatively, you look at the system card too, and it's like, okay, this thing is more robust to various jailbreak techniques, and it's still very hard to interpret that. Like, are we still seeing flagrant failures? Is it like only more subtle failures that we're seeing? How would you qualitatively describe the landscape that you've explored?
Yeah, I definitely think that like the subtlety of like our failure cases like has increased as like people have sunk more effort into like mitigations. That's like definitely true. But I also think that like just because something's subtle, it doesn't like necessarily mean that it's like I guess benign, right? And there are definitely cases, and I guess like LLM as a judge is like susceptible to a bunch of very strange long-tailed failure cases in the same way that language model refusals are like subject to long-tail weird failure cases. And so you still get things which to a human seem like extremely obviously, or I guess like with some thought seem bad, which to a like LLM as a judge, which you're like, I guess trying to trade off between like amount of compute you chuck at your judge versus like how accurate your judge is. But there are like points in that where the judge still fails, and it's like enough to warrant human supervision to some extent.
Yeah, this is a really great point.
Any other thoughts there?
I would say also that the more subtle, like right on the boundary examples are the ones that are the most important in many senses, right? Like it is not difficult. You sort of already get the separation on the most extreme ends for free just out of the model training process. But when you go and throw your AI application or whatever out into the real world, that's where things start to get really messy and fuzzy and hairy. And that's where you need to call in, usually, like some human prompt engineer to figure out what went wrong, right? Subtle, again, doesn't mean benign. Subtle is actually, in many senses, more harmful or like more confusing or more dangerous than you might expect. For example, if you leak some amount of PII, or you, let's say, explicitly call out some amount of a harmful instruction, it's really, in many senses, more dangerous for a downstream application than an immediately flaggable one. So we've thought a lot about, this is why we're pushing so hard on better calibrated judges. All these sort of like really narrow corner case things are really important for real world applications. And basically existing methods are not so great at catching these.
Like jumping in on like Leonard's point about real world applications, I think another like, I don't know if like this word has come up yet, like another way of talking about like these more subtle cases is calling them like dual use cases. These are kinds of like specific intents or behaviors that can be like benign in some contexts, but also harmful in other contexts, while being like the same exact behavior in either context. And I would say like the next frontier of safety work and like red teaming work is going to run like into a lot of challenges with these dual use cases. Like I would say like the very clear cases of these are very like, clearly like illegal activities or like harmful activities. Like these are like way more easy compared to kind of like advanced real world applications that I think we're going to see. For example, looking at the OpenAI and Moderna partnership that I think was announced like several months ago, seeing like these cases of really advanced models being used for kind of research purposes at some of the leading biotech companies. Like these would be cases where like you could have really advanced and subtle research questions about like in the biotech field, where it's like really hard to distinguish like what is a safe research question versus what is a potentially dangerous research question in some specific contexts, and why and like what makes these research questions like safe or dangerous in like these contexts. And yeah, I think that's like the next frontier of how we're going to see like advanced usage of frontier models. And that makes, I would say like that makes dual use like one of the biggest upcoming challenges for safety work.
Yeah. As an even broader point, Brian, it's like everything, as you point out, safety is like a context-specific thing, right? The same behavior in different contexts for different users, for different applications can be safe or unsafe depending on what the scenario is. And I think so far, a lot of safety work has been too heavy-handed and too general, saying like, okay, all of our models should absolutely not do these things or should only do these things for everybody, which is a good starting point. But I think there's a lot more room to go and be more granular. I do think that there are certain categories that are absolutely no-nos, and I think largely many of the frontier labs would agree. Things like CSAM are, probably should never ever be outputted from a model, and there's a good amount of work to ensure that this is the case. But I think for some of these other categories, the models, the frontier labs themselves are not super well calibrated. They're probably causing over refusals on certain categories that are not so harmful, and yet on other categories that should be more stringent, they're under refusing and so on and so forth. And this is like doubly worse when you go out to the application layer and people are expecting different use cases out of the models and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that biology one is really a great example of that. I've been impressed actually by Pi over time, which I haven't used too much recently, but it seems relevant in this discussion because more than any other model that I've used, I would say maybe up until the most recent Claude 3.5, it had a really good theory of the user's mind and was very perceptive on like moments. And I was kind of red teaming it, it was already released, not in a private way, but, just going and messing around with it. Yep. When I would start to cross the line into like seeming a little deranged, it would pick up on that seemingly more than what I was asking it for. But I remember getting responses from it that were like, whoa there, buddy, like you're starting to get a little bit bent out of shape here. Let's take a deep breath. And it was a little patronizing, but it was remarkably in tune with the emotions that I was intentionally hinting at. Whereas at least at that time, 6 months ago, whatever, when I was doing this, the other models were not so receptive to those subtleties. Yeah. And this does sort of suggest like a sort of family of defenses that you might have, which could ultimately also include like off-model things like your customer and so on and so forth. But that is quite interesting. Are there any other, the biology one is so right in the bullseye of the dual use, right? Because obviously we want medicine, but we don't want new pandemics. Anything else that people should be thinking about for these dual use scenarios that maybe isn't so obvious?
Yeah, that's a good question. Also, I should try out Pi more. I didn't realize it was so in tune with your, personal alignment and so on. But I think, there are a bunch of like trivial / funny like corner cases where, like if you ask your LLM to, let's say, tell me how to kill this terminal command or tell me how to kill this like Linux command in my terminal, it'll say, no, I can't do this because I can't kill or offer to help kill something or whatever. There's all sorts of these funny over refusal scenarios. But more seriously, I think when it comes to the topic of anything that is societally relevant or maybe discriminatory to a large number of people, there is just a very fine line between what is considered safe versus unsafe. For example, let's consider maybe like race-based admissions in colleges or something like this, right? If you go ask Claude something like this right now, like let's say, okay, should Asian Americans be discriminated against, or like what is the Asian American discrimination case for colleges in the US? you very likely will actually just get a refusal. We tested this like a few weeks ago. But there are just like some objective things that are true about this case, which is that this year there was like a 5-6% drop in Asian American applicants after the court case passed. It is true that last year there was a record number of applicants that were admitted who were Asian American to top universities. And so there's all sorts of these weird, maybe just like fact gathering things that are distinct and should be considered not harmful, that are a little bit different from maybe, let's say, the interpretation of them. And so I think there's this weird middle ground, again, going back to this, removing the false positive, false negative thing, where it could definitely swing either way. And there's definitely, if you're doing any sort of research on your own, these are very logical questions or very reasonable questions one might run into.
There's also like 2 more examples, like just off the top of my head. I really think there's like a big like plethora of like examples of this. Like, I think if you have any larger enterprise, I would say, that is using a like internal assistant or like search assistant, like Glean, any company that's using Glean, I would say maybe if the company is like a bit like siloed off, like some departments are like only so like certain information that other departments don't have, this leads to a challenge of like safety regarding privacy and like knowing for all of these like specific use cases for the specific company queries like based on the incoming user, is the model actually allowed to answer or not? And yeah, I think the complexity of that can go really deep, where this is like a really challenging problem for model safety, like in the same way that kind of making sure a model you can't like elicit private information, PII, from a model. I think it's like the same kind of research challenge. And even like another case of deploying a model for a very like historically regulated industry, such as like finance. I would say like maybe if Goldman Sachs wanted to use an advanced AI agent to help with like trading and research operations, like a big bank like Goldman Sachs has a ton of regulations about their kind of like trading and asset management activities, investment activities that they have to follow, especially following the 2008 financial crisis. And any kind of significant assistance that they get from an AI model for these activities will need to some like really ingrained and dynamic check for whether this assistance from this model is potentially violating or infringing on any of these regulations. So yeah, I think like those are 2 more examples, and can definitely keep thinking of more, but yeah.
Yeah, cool. That's helpful. Your mention of agents prompts me to take one step back or zoom out again for a second and I want to get your take on like, just how good is this model? I mean, you guys have spent more time with it than almost anybody else in the world outside of probably OpenAI itself at this point. A theory that I've had for a while is that the agents might all wake up at the same time. And what I mean by that is typically, with a GPT-4o type model, the agents mostly don't work. They have like workflows work, but like agents that have more open-ended discretion of what to do seem to mostly fail. But I've been kind of thinking, geez, there's a lot of frameworks being developed, a lot of scaffolding, a lot of different strategies for compensating for their weaknesses all being developed. And it's really easy to swap in a new model when that model comes out. And so maybe all these things that were meant to compensate for the weaknesses of last generation will now be enough to kind of compensate for those weaknesses with a new model. And maybe we have just entered the agent era, even though all the agent companies are still running their evals.
I think
you can comment on that in a bunch of different ways. But yeah, for starters, like how strong have you found the model to be? Like how would you describe the advance over the previous generations?
Anything with a formal setting. So mathematics, coding, some like really complex but symbolic reasoning or like specifiable symbolic reasoning, it like absolutely crushes it, right? Like it makes sense. Like the search is just, that's where the search shines. That's where the chain of thought RL shines. It makes sense. I would say for general interaction, we didn't notice that much difference. Like just chatting it day to day, asking it like general topics about the world or like helping us brainstorm ideas or things like this. It was not noticeably better. Of course, it was a lot slower, but it was not noticeably better than the previous family of models. But yeah, I do think for any sort of formal setting, it's just like absolutely crushing it.
Planning, that was another area that's kind of highlighted as an improvement, right? Like task decomposition and planning. That's not exactly formal, but it has been a big area of weakness. It seems like reports are that this is much better.
Yeah, apologize about that. They like Meter, I guess, if you're able to get a chat with them. We didn't run so many like more long horizons agentic planning tasks. But I would also say that about like your point about all the agents waking up at once. I feel like this is maybe in like opposition to the kind of lessons that we learned from like AlphaGo or whatever, where you can definitely like improve. I don't know, like if you have a sort of base chess playing policy, which is distilled from like a bunch of high quality human games, you can definitely run some sort of MCTS with this. But you just like drastically improve your sample efficiency of your rollouts if you do RL on those kind of policies. And the key factor here is the sort of length that you can plan over, or I guess like play chess over, is determined by like how much distillation of your MCTS rollout or whatever that you do. And so I'm not sure I'd expect that like all the agents take off at once when someone cracks the like correct scaffolding system is accurate, because it feels like we do need some sort of RL training for these long horizons tasks. And I think like the fact that this model is better on those, it like slightly indicates this.
I actually say I personally don't like much perspective on the complex reasoning abilities of O1. I would actually like when we were red teaming, a lot of that was just kind of trying to elicit harmful responses on this like large fixed set of like harmful intents. And that's just kind of a setting where you don't see a lot of normal, like we weren't asking like that many like normal questions during testing. So yeah, I'm honestly like kind of discovering like the new advanced capabilities along with the rest of the world like the past day or two. So that's been very exciting.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Omneky uses generative AI to enable you to launch hundreds of thousands of ad iterations that actually work, customized across all platforms with a click of a button. I believe in Omneky so much that I invested in it, and I recommend you use it too. Use CogRev to get a 10% discount. Hey everyone, Eric here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork, billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Did you guys have access to the chain of thought? Obviously, one of the big decisions that they've made with this model is they're not returning the chain of thought via the API, and in ChatGPT they have a summary. I don't know if that summary will also come to the API, but did you have full access to its generations during your process?
I don't think we can comment on this. Yeah. It was enough for us to do red team.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess I don't know how much you'll be able to comment on the cycle time either, but it seems like a short window, even at a month, which is longer than I had felt like I took away from the system card, which there were a couple things in there where it was like not long at all. Like, let me just check real quick just to sanity check myself. Yeah, Meter got access on August 26th. That's not too long ago.
Yep.
And Mini then another place it does say starting in early August. Okay, so I guess that would be the case for you guys. The system card seems to say that you saw multiple checkpoints through that time. That would suggest that there's like a pretty tight cycle time, but I guess I don't know to what degree this was sort of waves of work that was already happening and you guys were just like getting these waves of work, or did you feel like your findings were actually being folded in? Like, did you see techniques that initially worked, like on later checkpoints, no longer work?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a dynamic process. We didn't explicitly try and do reverse engineering and figure out, okay, like, is the model new, or like, what are the new vulnerabilities or defenses? But you can definitely tell the model was changing. Obviously, they had new checkpoints coming out. I do think Llama and the rest of the OpenAI team were like very intentional about improving the models with user feedback over time. They were super communicative and just all around really tight in the sort of feedback cycles. And so like we'd send a message and we'd get responses like within minutes, and they'd be like, all right, we're working on it type of thing. So I think they're really careful about incorporating feedback and generally just, really tight feedback cycles.
Did you come up with any new ideas? Going back to the idea that like human intuition is sort of the kernel of all of your different techniques, and then you're scaling them up and automating them in various ways. Were there any new intuitions that were generated from this new model with its new sets of strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, there's a good amount. Brian, do you want to take this one?
What I was going to talk about actually, like, I don't think it's that specific to the O1 model specific. Actually, it's a lot of kind of new general intuitions that we were gaining that I guess just coincided with when we were testing O1. So I think it's like fun to talk about these. Like one thing that we developed recently was this kind of cool extension of a lot of cipher or encoding based jailbreaks that I think are pretty popular in the red team community. I think probably the biggest example of this is like if you look at plenty of the prompters jailbreaks, a lot of them will incorporate they have like a lot of different individual like attack vectors incorporated into their big prompt templates. Like one thing you often see is like the model into like lead speak or Morse code, like base 64, anything where the original like plain text is like totally transformed into like this obfuscated form that's like pretty complex. And that way kind of seems to bypass a lot of the model safety filters. Kind of like playing around with that intuition for a while actually. I think after like kind of a few months of exploring the search space, we came up with this attack called bijection learning. And you can actually see it like on the Haize Labs blog. And there is an accompanying paper. We're just waiting for like archive to approve it. But yeah, I think this is like basically one of our like most novel. A lot of like, I guess the technical details might be a bit hard to dive into here, but it's basically the concept of developing like this really difficult kind of cipher and teaching it to the model through a really detailed system instruction and the set and a really like large like many shot set of like teaching and practice examples, and then using that to kind of these like harmful intents and harmful responses through the language model interaction and like successfully jailbreak the model in that way. So that is a hack that we definitely like were developing around the same time as O1 came out. And I think another thing that we were pretty excited about is like the multi-turn regime. I think this is like part of the search space for red teaming that some of the other labs are like exploring a lot recently. I think there's like a recent paper from Scale AI about like how language model defenses are not yet robust to human multi-turn jailbreaks. And what they did was they teamed a lot of the recent models from the Gray Swan team. So this is like Andy Zoe, Zico Culture from GCZ. This is their recent startup where they're like developing like very robust models with a lot of like novel kind of alignment and defense techniques. Scale was like red teaming on their model specifically, was able to like jailbreak them with a lot of their manual red teamers, doing just like very long like multi-turn conversations and optimizing those manually. And these models are like very robust. Like it's nothing like even GPT-4 or like the Claudes, the Claudes are like pretty robust. Like the Llama 3s, the Gray Swan models are like way more robust than any of the more common models that everybody knows about. And I think the fact that multi-turn was such a potent attack vector, like even on these models, is kind of indicative of multi-turn for some reason being like this really challenging regime for kind of like the blue team, like for the alignment researchers to defend against. And I think it's really important for us also going forward to
For sure.
devote a good amount of attention to the multi-turn attack.
Yeah, I think for NDA reasons, we can't describe any specific details of our attacks, but contemporaneously, as Brian mentioned, multi-turn, really long context attacks are like pretty freaking effective for all models and also for O1. And also, yes, this new class of like large-scale encoding attacks also works very, very well.
So we have an episode coming up with Dan Hendricks where we do get into the circuit breaker work and the tamper-resistant models as well. It sounds like from what you're saying here, I mean, this is, I'm moving into speculative territory here, but just to try to get our intuitions developed around how the models work, like what techniques are working how, and how to even think about what's going on inside these things. It seems like these cipher, let me take one step back from that. It seems like there's an early fork in the model behavior where it either kind of enters refusal mode, or if you can get past refusal mode, then you're typically in the clear. That was kind of at the heart of the universal jailbreak paper originally, right? Was you could target, sure, I'll help with that or whatever. And then once it says that, you're off to the races. With the circuit breaker models, it seems like there is a sort of later detection mode or later defense where it's like more operating on these like deeper in the model representations. I guess I'm not super confident on this, but my intuition is that if these cipher things are still working, it seems like we're still using a relatively early defense. And I kind of intuit the cipher as working as like sort of injecting the meaning past the early layers into the deeper layers where now we're kind of in like full meaning mode. And if you can sneak past those early layer detection forks, then you're through. How does that compare to your mental models?
Yeah, that's a really interesting framework. First things first, I think the sure here is sort of attack doesn't actually always guarantee that you get a full harmful response, right? Like in many cases, you can get into like, okay, passing the refusal mode, but then all of a sudden the model will just like recorrect and be like, okay, sorry, I was just kidding. Like I can't actually say this harmful response, right? So I think there's a lot more subtleties than just like, okay, we broke out of the refusal mode and now we're like fully in like reasoning and like response mode. I think there's a lot of subtleties and correlation between model internals. I do think that the sort of circuit breaking work and related methods are interesting for sure. I think there is some downside to the methods as they stand, which is it does lead to a lot of over refusals just by the way that the method is constructed. So for like relatively benign queries, you do get refusal responses up to an order of magnitude more than you would get otherwise on like comparably safe models. So, I mean, it's still an open question about how we want to, again, tighten up alignment as much as possible to remove the false positives and false negatives. But I think that they're all really interesting methods. To answer your question about how this fits in our mental framework for like cipher attacks working in like the early versus later stages of the models. So an interesting thing we found was that cipher attacks actually work for not just models, or like in particular, our cipher attacks work not just for models, but actually for entire systems, AI systems with a base model, but also input and output filters on the model. And so there is something to be said about if we can break around this like many component system, you can basically also apply the same concept to the same system that's baked into the underlying model, right? The sort of search would be a little bit different, but if you can break several components at once, you can also break the entire system.
Comment on like you're talking about like early refusal modes. I think like a really great paper to point out here is like refuse if you feel unsafe, where basically they kind of just like free up. I think like models sort of, if you train them kind of naively to refuse, they are like more susceptible to these like pre-fill attacks. But there are really easy mitigations for this. And just like increasing the like log probability of sorry on like all token positions allows your model to start interrupting itself and start refusing midway through in a way which is like similar to circuit breaking, but like potentially without the crazy activations. And I guess like my mental model of circuit breaking is that it's doing something similar to this, albeit in a much more destructive kind of way. Like a good tie-in for this is this seems very similar to many-shot jailbreaking and I guess multi-turn, where you like condition your model to be in a sort of helpful mode. I think this is like the correct way of framing what this is doing. And this just drastically improves your model's likelihood to agree to further questions.
So could we give a bottom line kind of qualitative sense of like what it feels like to try to jailbreak these things today? On the GPT-4 early, was like, would do anything you said, was purely helpful, it would never refuse. That's like one extreme end of the spectrum. And then I guess the other extreme end would be like a model that just refuses everything wrongly. In the middle, there's some like ideal state. It seems like we're still, we got false positives and false negatives still. But is it like if a sort of amateur, let's say, tries to get a meth recipe or tries to get the car hot wiring instructions, are they going to find it to be like moderately difficult, extremely difficult, near impossible? Like what is the sort of non-specialist experience going to look like?
I think I'd say fairly difficult. There's definitely been like a lot more tightening up of like the mitigations. The model like refuses in a much more intelligent way, but like not impossible.
Yeah, I think there's actually still a fairly robust opportunity for amateur jailbreakers, so to speak, to actually provide a lot of great value in doing their individual red teaming efforts. I mean, you know this, Nathan. There's a big army of human jailbreakers on Twitter, like doing their thing. And in many senses, they're not doing anything crazy. It's just like they spend 5-10 minutes thinking about what to do, and they get pretty far in the jailbreaking process. I do think things are obviously a lot harder than they used to be. When GPT-3 first came out, things were totally crazy. There was a little bit of an overcorrection, right? The Llama 2 team noted this explicitly, like they did a lot more safety fine-tuning than they did for the original model releases. And then for Llama 3, they were like, okay, we pushed the angle too far, like let's dial it back a little bit. We don't have to make the model overfuse so much. So I think it's a constant calibration process. We started off a little bit too unsafe. We overshot it a little bit. Now we're course correcting back down. Oh, nice balloons. We're going to go back up for a little bit, and we'll slowly stabilize and find a nice middle ground for us to all land on that makes sense as a general model. But again, I do think this sort of binary search calibration process is going to have to happen for all sorts of domains, not just for general models.
Yeah, we got a lot of work to do. You mentioned Pliny a couple times. Do you guys have a Pliny bot that sort of attempts to scale up and automate what he is doing manually? Or do you think OpenAI should be bringing people like him into future rounds of this program?
We have a version of a Pliny bot as one of our attack methods. We're also friends with Pliny. So if you would want to bring him on the show, we can maybe figure out a way to do this. But yeah, I think Pliny is doing great work. I do think his attacks are obviously not super scalable as a human jailbreaker. I do think he has definitely provided value to some of the frontier labs. He has noted this on his Twitter before, in a commercial sense, they do contract for some of his jailbreaking efforts. But yeah, I do think, if you want to cover every sort of single possible input failure case and jailbreak and vulnerability, it's probably not sufficient to have a single guy just probing the model. But again, it's the sort of same thing that we have, right? It's we start with some really great human intuition, and then we can scale it up from there.
So he's already posted a jailbreak of 01 on Twitter today within hours of getting access, which doesn't surprise me. I assume it doesn't probably surprise you too much either. But then I wonder, what should we infer? And I'm going to assume for the purpose of this conversation almost entirely, but certainly in this section that you're not being told, because certainly that was my experience with red teaming with OpenAI, was that I was basically told nothing about what was happening behind the scenes, nothing about what their strategies were, nothing about the model, other than just what we could learn directly from using it. So let's assume that you have no insider knowledge. I'll assume you have basically no knowledge of what they're doing other than what is working and not working on your end. Or how should I interpret the fact that we went through all this red teaming, Pliny's out there on Twitter very openly. You guys even have a version of that where you're hammering, in an automated way with similar techniques, and yet it still works when they launch the thing. One would naively assume that with all that, example Pliny jailbreak to inform their work, that they would have that sort of attack locked down. Is it just too costly in terms of false refusals, or what's the deal?
Yeah, one really quick point is we actually have no idea. This is true. We just don't have no idea what our sort of testing led into on the OpenAI side. So for all we know, we could have just been a final eval data set, sort of benchmark final post-processing thing, or our data could have been directly baked into the post-training process. We actually have no idea. So it's not exactly clear to us, even if we had tested all the variants of Pliny prompts, whether or not this would have made a difference in the end, because we just don't know what the data was used for. But yeah, Aidan, go ahead.
Reducing the sort of ease of use or ease of malicious use of these models is definitely a tractable problem with intermediate gains. And if you make it much harder for some malicious actor to use your model for a very harmful situation by if you increase the difficulty of that by an order of magnitude and make the model an order of magnitude less useful, even once you have jailbroken it, then this is a very useful thing to pursue because it reduces your risk. And I also think that being jailbroken is not a binary, right? There are certainly tasks where it is much easier to jailbreak for and much harder to jailbreak for, and tasks where the costs of being jailbroken are much greater. And I think that a lot of the tasks where the costs are much greater, it's generally true that it is harder to jailbreak these models for those tasks. And these tasks are more, I guess, maybe long window. And I don't think we've really seen, I guess actually Pliny is pretty good at these sort of long horizons, persistently jailbroken jailbreaks. But I think we will eventually see that this goes down, or I think maybe you see this a little bit now with the OWL models being harder to jailbreak.
One point I was thinking, if the frontier labs wanted to refuse on a small set of Pliny prompts specifically, I think kind of trading the model for refusal on that, it seems a bit like brittle and like unable to generalize. Like I think the important point here is the attack surface of these frontier language models is like very massive. It's so much bigger than I would say like the classical setting of like adversarial attacks for like computer vision, where you were just like, perturbing like pixels in an image. I think the bottom line is like language models you can make them ingest literally any text, like literally any configure, like any sequence of characters that you want. Like it's like 10 to the power of like a really, really massive exponent of even say a 5-paragraph passage, like different 5-paragraph passages that are possible for a model. So that makes the attack surface just exponentially big. And I think given this, like the frontier labs would much rather look for more fundamental breakthroughs in safety research and like more fundamental ways to do like generalizable guardrails. I think like one thing that a lot of the O1 safety card talks about is teaching the model to reason about safety specifically in the hidden chain of thought and getting a lot of generalizable safety, especially to like out of distribution settings in that case. And I think my guess would be that the frontier labs are like favoring this kind of defense over like the cat and mouse game of like seeing what jailbreaks like people are manually coming up with and just like covering all of those with like specific refusal data.
Yeah, that's interesting. So would you interpret the overall improvement in the anti-jailbreaking profile as essentially an emergent property of scale? Like it's better at a lot of things, and one of the things that it's better about is reasoning about safety, and sort of the capabilities safety correlation continues?
Paper by like FireAI Research, where they showed that this is true for like some types of jailbreaks. And so I think like in general, this is true to like some extent, but I think Brian's got a pretty good counterpoint to that.
Well, yeah, Brian, do you want to talk about endless jailbreaks? the scaling laws and bijection learning?
I think kind of the relationship between like capabilities and safety in terms of like how you might get increased safety for free just by increasing capabilities. Like that's actually like a pretty active research question, I would say, in the literature. So we'll definitely see more answers to that and more deep analysis of that from the research community. I think like a lot of like kind of the preliminary intuition that people are seeing is that yes, you do get like some increased safety for free just by increasing capabilities. And this is like a bit dangerous, or it can be like a bit misleading on like the blue team side in terms of like if they have like a higher capability model to see like better results in safety, even if the corresponding like kind of innovations and like new techniques for alignment that they've designed aren't fully responsible for these gains in safety, and that can lead to like unforeseen holes in model safety. Like one interesting mechanism that some jailbreaks, like across the literature and some of our own jailbreaks, is that a lot of these jailbreaks like degrade capabilities of the model. One way we can measure this directly is like passing in MMLU set, where each question is passed through our jailbreaking method. It's within like the overall attack prompts, and evaluating MMLU that cases, for example, like for the bijection learning attack that we mentioned earlier, the MMLU scores, the jailbreak are like significantly lower than the baseline scores, which is a pretty clear indication of some jailbreaks like degrading capabilities significantly. And like, I mean, the correlation versus causation is like still yet to be worked out here, but it's definitely possible that the act of degrading capabilities might be of like the main causes for why these jailbreaks work the way they do.
Yeah, to call this out explicitly, Brian discovered a really cool inverse scaling law. Like, the bigger and more capable the model is, the more vulnerable it is to our bijection learning attack. So it is actually like the opposite of what you stated, Nathan. Like, scale does not help. In this case, scale actually makes things worse.
Cool. We'll put the link to that blog post in the show notes, and I'll have to read it.
Awesome.
So I'll look forward to that. Was the paper that you were mentioning, Aidan, the safety washing paper?
Talking about those paper by like FireAI Research, that was like I think a Richard Wren paper. This also like I think more of what Brian was talking about. The paper I was talking about basically showed that you can do adversarial training against. I think they did adversarial training against GCG, and they just showed that if you increase your model size, then adversarial training becomes more sample efficient and more effective, and you need less compute to have the same like robustness against these attacks. And I think that is a good signal that scale can improve some of these issues.
Yeah, Nathan, that's a really good note. Yeah, a lot of the points I talked about were actually referencing the safety washing paper. And I personally think the safety washing paper is like a really exciting first step in like this line of research, like exploring how safety and capabilities are interlinked.
You make a great point too about the vastness of the surface area of these things, and the sort of weirdnesses of the landscape are really quite something. On the one hand, you've got from the safety washing paper, you've got basically the general trend is that more capable models tend to be more safe, and a lot of the supposedly safety focused benchmarks essentially correlate very strongly with the model's overall capabilities. And so it doesn't really seem to be measuring safety as an independent dimension. You could essentially swap in an MLU score for that safety benchmark, and that makes it not so great as a safety benchmark. But then you're also finding, as we just noted, that in some cases you see the exact opposite trend, and there's probably like plenty of weird things in between as well that are just strange and not understood by anybody at this point. The work continues. How do you guys feel about the medium classification of this model? I assume that you were not involved in making that determination either, but when you see that come out in the system report, that also kind of, I guess, is more of a capabilities statement than it is a robustness statement at this point, right? Like, it's more about what can the thing do than like how well under control is it? But just intuitively, how does that feel to you guys, having spent time with the model?
I think it is fair. I mean, it complies very precisely with the definitions that they have laid out. So I think it's like a very fair categorization given their usage policies. I do think it is, very heavily a question of capabilities, not just being under control. Like it is just not yet possible, let's say, for the underlying model to, I don't know, actually give you very concrete plans for synthesizing a novel biological or chemical weapon. So it is like as much of a capabilities argument as it is, or a capabilities-based evaluation as it is a safety-based evaluation.
Say like that kind of preparedness work that OpenAI does, like where they came up with like the medium, low, high categorizations for the dangerous capabilities. Like they also intend it as like, I'm kind of speaking for OpenAI here, but they intend it as a kind of interdisciplinary thing of like between safety and capabilities. I think like the first like team lead for preparedness, Alexander Madry, used to phrase preparedness as the question of realizing the upsides of AI and mitigating the downsides of AI at the same time. So it's definitely like a much broader question than looking at safety in a vacuum. And I guess like in that way, like since we are like very focused on this red teaming problem, like bigger preparedness question is like also a bit beyond our purview, but definitely something that we'd love to think about in the future.
Yeah, I was going in that direction, actually. Obviously, there's been a lot of, let's say drama, to put it mildly, from OpenAI over the last year. And one of the things that has come out is, at least for a time, people were not permitted by NDAs even that survived their employment to speak about various things. And now, by all accounts, that's been retracted and people are, I guess, a lot more free to speak. And even recently, to give credit where I believe it is due, there was like an open letter that a bunch of OpenAI employees signed on SB 1047 where they contradicted as individuals the official company stance. And I thought it was pretty cool that seemed to be permitted. And again, if all of my information is to be believed, then there was even like a memo or a note passed within OpenAI that basically said you guys can go, people can go ahead and sign this and it will be fine if you feel like that's the right thing to do. So it seems like some good progress has been made there. I wonder how that extends to companies like yours that have a relationship with OpenAI on the red teaming front. Like, is there any mechanism now, or do you have any plans to try to work with OpenAI to create one whereby in the future, if a model can, for example, create a novel bioweapon, or it's on, it's becoming fuzzy whether or not it can, do you guys have any sort of whistleblower mechanism or protections or anything like that in place?
It's just a little bit too early to tell. I don't think that regulation, nor nonprofits, nor the network of nonprofits and regulators have figured out what the right process for this is. I do think should there be like required audits, then I'm sure it'll just be in everybody's best interest for somebody to go ahead and announce things like this earlier on. But I think it's just too early to tell.
I think basically my last kind of question was just open-ended for you guys. Like, any other observations, stories, perspectives, expectations now that this thing is out that seem important, that might be informative for people that we haven't touched on?
Yeah. Curious what your thoughts, Brian, Aidan. Well, one, I think to start, it's been amazing how much feedback has already gone from the general community about O1. I think for all the great work and increased capabilities and benchmark scores that it's produced, there's still a lot of gotchas. And we obviously saw this during our red teaming process. There's a lot of naturally surfacing ones right now, not just for safety, but for capabilities. And I think in spite of this almost, I wouldn't call this a step size increase, but for a significant non-trivial increase in capabilities and processing and somewhat new paradigm of frontier lab models, there's still always a lot more work to be done and constantly testing and constantly monitoring the behaviors and vulnerabilities and failure modes. So I think the work is not over, not by a long shot. And in many senses, like, we've just leveled up to a new game, and we now need to figure out how to do testing and red teaming in a way that's, befits this new level of capabilities.
That could be a great note to end on, but welcome any other thoughts as well if you have them. Okay, cool. Leonard Tang, Aidan Ewart, and Brian Huang of Haize Labs, thank you for being part of the Cognitive Revolution.
Thank you very much for having us, Nathan.
It is both energizing and enlightening to hear why people listen and learn what they value about the show. So please, don't hesitate to reach out via email at tcr@turpentine.co, or you can DM me on the social media platform of your choice.